Brought to you by Charity Mobile, the phone company that supports life and family. 5% of your monthly plan price goes to your favorite charity. Mention offer code TRADITION for a special Christmas offer. Learn more at CharityMobile.com.
Reform is a buzzword that is being thrown around a lot these days. Get to secular reforms that we're talking about in everyday life in our political sphere, even though we're all exhausted of politics. But reform is something we keep hearing in the church. Reform, reform, reform. And to be sure, the Catholic Church has undergone reforms in the past. Some of these examples include the foundation of new religious orders, the changing of how priests are trained. At one point, they were essentially apprentices to existing priests or to bishops, and then they got trained that way, to the founding of actual seminaries in the structure we see today, as well as to structural reforms like under Pope St. Gregory the Great and other such reforms. Reform is nothing new and can often be a good thing, but the good reforms of the church were usually tied to a deepening of the Catholic faith in practice by the laity and in among the bishops and priests. Meaning, in plainest language, people were expected to pray and fast more, to actually live Catholicism more fully or deeply. That is what's missing in all this reform talk in the church today. We have bishops and priests and Pope and everybody else talking a good game lately about synodality and reforming the fundamental structures of the church and all the rest. And it's always couched in the language of making people feel good, accompaniment, dialogue, and all the rest of it. Rarely is a deepening in our faith in Christ and in the church and everything else brought into this. The faith is usually left at the door. We see the reforms that are proposed presented to us in fundamentally materialist kinds of ways, which should be, frankly, alarming to people. But it isn't. We don't know why that is. Instead, modernists in Rome, these material and, frankly, formal heretics who think they know better than what the church has taught on various issues going back to the beginning, basically, they believe they know better than the inspired writers of Scripture, the church fathers, the great popes of history, and all the rest of it. They want to, quote, reform the church. And by doing, their method for doing it is to impose materialist structures, meaning worldly values, onto the church. They look to NGOs and to governments and see how their structural reforms that made things more efficient or whatever, and they go, hey, let's do that in the Catholic Church. And for some things, that's probably fine. If you're having financial governance problems in the church, looking to see how governments and NGOs spent less money or put safeguards on, that's probably fine. But if you want to really reform the church, periodically the church needs internal reformation, internal, little r reformation. It has to be with a deepening of the faith, a deepening of the practice of the Catholic faith. In short, with a call to conversion. And that's what's missing in today's story. So we go to katholisch.de, the official news arm of the German bishops. Again, whenever they publish a story with a proposal for change, it is them endorsing that change. This is their official news arm. Nothing gets by them, the most heretical bishops in all the church, for my money. Go with them for this headline. Pope's advisor Scicluna, Cardinal Scicluna, Roman Curia must change. What consequences will the World Synod have for the Church? If the Pope's confidant Charles Scicluna has his way, there will soon be checklists for the work of bishops and a new leadership style in the Vatican. New leadership style. Great. Checklists. Wonderful. Something missing here in a lot of this, or downplayed severely. But all this sounds pretty simple, right? We've clearly entered an age of reform in the secular world and in the church world, with the incoming American president talking about shaking the federal government up to the point where for a lot of people it won't even be recognizable when he's done if he gets his way. And we hear similar things from Rome about the Roman Curia. I'm less inclined to believe that the proposed reforms of the Roman Curia are good because they are based on this concept of a synodal inversion of the hierarchy, which is frankly not even remotely Catholic. It's not. Christ established a hierarchical church, with the Pope at the top as his vicar on earth, as his representative. But reforms are going to happen, whether the typical Catholic who is paying attention wants them to happen or not. And Cardinal Scicluna is a good foot soldier for Pope Francis and will go along with his every whim on this mania for reform. Here's the inside scoop on what needs to be done to Rome by the Bergoglians according to the Bergoglians, because they think this synodal reformation of the church is desired by God. Most of them are true believers, which is what makes them the most dangerous. Do not dismiss them as just being atheistic. That the true believer, the one who believes they're on a mission from God, is the most dangerous. From the article, quote, the Archbishop of Malta and Pope's confidant, Charles Scicluna, has called for a new leadership style in the Roman Curia. We must create a culture of transparency and accountability at all levels, Scicluna told the Jesuit newspaper America. After the World Synod, the Curia can no longer say, the law is laid down here and must be followed out there, said Scicluna. He hopes for a new, more inclusive attitude. Laws should not only be laid down in the Vatican, but also followed and modified in dialogue with the world church. For example, the publication of a Vatican document must in future be preceded by a transparent process of consultation. Any other approach would violate the ethos of synodality, said the Archbishop. Scicluna also praised the final document of the World Synod. He particularly liked the call for a binding accountability and control mechanisms in the Church. I like the concept of checklists. Ideals and guidelines are pointless if there are no systems that allow for verification. The work and leadership style of the bishops must also be evaluated in a binding manner, as part of the regular ad limina visits, using checklists, said Scicluna. Scicluna warned against using the World Synod's methods of spiritual dialogue, an alternation of speaking and meditation without direct discussion, everywhere in the Church. For example, if I am dealing with financial experts for the audit of the Archdiocese of Malta, I do not need to have a spiritual dialogue with them. That's what he's warning against. Rather, it is then about the clear word. The 65-year-old archbishop and legal expert of Charles Scicluna is a member of the Bishops' Conference in Malta and assistant secretary in the Vatican Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. There he is responsible for dealing with cases of McCarrick kinds of problems. End quote. Man seems to really love his checklists. You know, that's a remarkable recommendation. There's one really remarkable thing in there, besides from this checklist stuff. The publication of a Vatican document must in the future be preceded by a transparent process of consultation. Can you imagine? Can you imagine a motu proprio or a papal encyclical written by a pope requiring consultation before it's published? Can you imagine some binding document like the infamous document on Marian apparitions from the now Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith requiring lay consultation beforehand? Can you imagine that? That is on its face nonsensical. Now, accountability is a good thing. Checklists, not so much. Again, that's worldly thinking. And it's not because checklists are a problem in and of themselves, but because it betrays their underlying thinking, aside from the fact that they're not actually thinking big when they're talking about fixing structural problems in the church, because there certainly are some. All you have to do is look at the financial problems that the Vatican has had, and you can see that there are structural problems that really need to be addressed. They're thinking of reforming the Roman Curia in purely materialistic terms, meaning worldly terms. If you want to reform the Roman Curia, if you want real reform in the church, bring in better priests, bring in better bishops, bring in better people to work in Rome. Francis has this rather bad habit of bringing in men with some rather nasty accusations laid against them to work in the Roman Curia, almost as if he's shielding them from the consequences of their evil deeds. But here's some basic reforms that should work for people. If you work in the Roman Curia, regardless of your rank, they should be making Holy Mass and public prayer and regular fasting with their spiritual director and making sure they get spiritual direction on a regular basis, and all the other old-fashioned Catholic ideas about achieving sanctity that seem to have gone out of style in our time, make them required as part of their job. Their spiritual director will be part of that accountability process. Accountability is a good thing. Make all of those things central to the expectations their superiors in the hierarchy will have for them. People who work in the Roman Curia should be seriously on the road to sanctification. And yes, the Pope, whoever it is at the time, should be front and center in these things. He should be leading by personal example. especially in our time, if we're talking about Francis, he should be publicly announcing that he is within accordance of his age. The man is not a young man anymore, fasting and doing all the rest of the things. He should be talking about it publicly, leading by example, leading public rosaries, and all the rest of the things that, if you read the writings of the saints, that the saints always advocated for those trying to achieve sanctification. There were two great reformers in the church's history before the so-called Reformation: St. Dominic and St. Francis of Assisi. They were friends. They nearly founded a religious order together, but their personal callings were very different. One of the things they had in common in their calls for reform of the church wasn't structural reforms and dialogue and accompaniment and all the rest of it. It was prayer and fasting. It was going to Mass on a regular basis. It was uniting your internal will, submitting your internal will to the will of God, remembering your place in the world. It's a far cry from the things we hear today. And this is really kind of at the crux of the problem. Rome has a gospel, a false gospel, of creating an earthly paradise. You see it in the focus on the works of mercy and the rest. You see it in the talk about all the eco-conversion. You see it in all kinds of things. Rarely do we hear about the consequences of sin. And that's a very real problem, because some of these problems they're talking about trying to fix, the McCarrick problem, accountability for that, those are very serious spiritual problems, the consequences of which go beyond the horrifying consequences that are material in nature for those problems. The spiritual consequences of that are devastating. Very rarely do we hear about spiritual conversions, about taking the faith much more seriously, submitting ourselves to Christ, living according to the way the church has always enjoined us to live. And until that becomes the center of talks of reform, I don't want to hear talks about structural reform for anybody except maybe the financial arm of the Vatican, which needs serious structural reform anyway. Are you surprised, really, that there's not a lot of a spiritual talk on this talk of reforming the church? Let me know in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. So just sharing this on social media, that helps too. And if you've ever thought about supporting the work of Return to Tradition through hitting that join button or supporting on Patreon or the rest, there are just options in the description box below. They do help keep these daily messages coming. Your support is greatly appreciated. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.